Thank you very much. So my presentation today kind of builds upon some ongoing work that we've been doing in relation to intellectual property and 3D printing. We've just published the new edited collection, 3D Printing and Beyond, Intellectual Property and Regulation, which is a kind of a co-edited work between myself, Professor Mark Lemley from Stanford Law School, and Danusha Mendez, a professor at Bournemouth University. Essentially it takes a comparative approach at looking at how intellectual property and 3D printing is dealt with in the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, and it also kind of touches upon a host of the new regulatory issues that have been appearing in relation to 3D printing, particularly in specialist areas like bioprinting and regulation of 3D printing of guns. So today's talk is really an extension of that preliminary work in relation to intellectual property and 3D printing. And I'm kind of really interested in how 3D printing is not only causing disruptions in relation to intellectual property law, policy and practice, but is also unsettling international trade law and regulation. In many ways, it picks up on some of the themes that we heard in the last session in terms of how do new technologies impact supply chains and logistics. In some ways, they're very similar questions in respect of 3D printing and additive manufacturing in terms of how will it affect some of the flows and patterns in relation to trade. As Paul Martin kind of noted at the beginning of the day, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not new technologies will reverse patterns of offshoring of manufacturing from developed countries to elsewhere. Will it lead to reshoring of technologies? That's a very critical question in relation to intellectual property and 3D printing. But really this is kind of part of a larger range of work which I'm collaborating with Dr. Kylie Pappalardo with and a number of other researchers and students at the moment. I always kind of like to now begin my talks about 3D printing, talking about Westworld and how 3D printing in some ways is something old and something new. I like Westworld in terms of its trailers, which have beautiful little montages developed through thinking about some of the future iterations of bioprinting. But there's also a very strong thread running through the Nolan series about who owns the intellectual property associated with 3D printing and bioprinting and the associated data. And there's also kind of a sense that 3D printing perhaps is much like the internet and cyberspace back in the 1990s. John Perry Barlow articulated a declaration of independence of cyberspace and kind of talked about how cyberspace was like the Wild West, and we see very similar sorts of issues in relation to the regulation of 3D printing. Just a little quick introduction to the technology. I think there's a lot of discussion about how do you classify and define various new technologies, and 3D printing in some ways has proven to be difficult in terms of classification in relation to intellectual property, but eventually there's been kind of efforts particularly in terms of the Patent Cooperation Treaty, to try to define it as a kind of a hybrid technology using or applying processes or apparatus that produce three-dimensionally shaped structures by selectively depositing successive layers of material one upon another. So 3D printing or additive manufacturing should be contrasted with subtractive manufacturing. The other thing to remember is that 3D printing often involves the sharing of various different files online, so that kind of raises kind of larger questions about the distribution of manufacturing. And there's also kind of larger discussion about how will 3D printing interact with, say, the Internet of Things. Will you be 3D printing the things that are then connected to one another on the internet? And a lot of discussion about whether or not it will be a productive Internet of Things, or will it be an Internet of garbage, or the Internet of insecure things. But 3D printing has taken on a number of different manifestations and has been applied in a range of different fields and sectors. So my colleague Dr. Cory Doctorow has been doing a lot of work looking at how 3D printing has been applied in relation to a whole wide range of creative industries, particularly in relation to art and craft and various different forms of design and jewellery and fashion. So in some ways 3D printing raises lots of different issues in relation to copyright law. At the same time, companies in many fields have adopted 3D printing for rapid prototyping of inventions. There has been an effort to try to use 3D printing in relation to the consumer and retail sector, although they dream of a 3D printer in every home has somewhat fizzled, and many of the companies who took that approach have since been subsumed into kind of larger entities. But a lot of conglomerates and industrial companies like General Electric and Siemens have adopted and applied 3D printing in terms of their manufacturing processes. And those big global companies have certainly been thinking about ways in which 3D printing might be helpful to them in terms of their global distribution, in terms of the trade of those items. And equally with the kind of the rise of metal 3D printing, there's been a lot of interest in terms of applications in relation to the car industry and transportation. Ford has kind of been very interested in trying to use 3D printing to give Motown an innovative edge to allow it to compete with Silicon Valley. There's a lot of interest in terms of some of the other applications of 3D printing in those areas. Likewise, there's been a great interest in terms of how 3D printing could be used for things like houses and building and bridges and engineering projects. A lot of work in relation to food, bioprinting, questions in terms of applications in relation to healthcare as well. I guess in relation to intellectual property law and policy, there's a kind of a larger debate about what sort of impact 3D printing will have upon the discipline. So Professor Mark Lemley from Stanford Law School has been of the view that 3D printing will be incredibly disruptive to some of the usual norms, standards and principles of intellectual property law. He argues that intellectual property law works on the basis of artificial scarcity, and he thinks that 3D printing, along with other technologies like synthetic biology and IT and biotech, will lead to a great deal of abundance, and that will disrupt some of the basic norms at work in relation to 3D printing and in relation to intellectual property. But, you know, there have been sceptics of that view. Some argue, like Gertrude van Overvoort, that intellectual property has long been able to absorb and accommodate and assimilate new technologies, and really 3D printing is the latest in a whole wide range of forms of intellectual property that have been gobbled up in terms of what can be accepted. Calestis Juma, who does lots of work on sustainable development, has made the insightful remark about intellectual property and 3D printing. What may appear on the surface as being intellectual property concerns may in fact reflect deeper tensions between technological innovation and incumbency. So in my presentation today, I really want to cover three kind of topics. I want to give you a case study of a clash over 3D printing dental appliances. I want to give you a sense of how the battles between superpowers that my colleague from the University of New South Wales talked about earlier today is impacting upon 3D printing and additive manufacturing. And then I just want to kind of wrap up by briefly kind of talking about what some global institutions are doing in relation to intellectual property and 3D printing. But first, just to give you some context, one of the kind of early big patent battles that we saw in relation to 3D printing was in relation to dental appliances that were kind of the work was being done in Pakistan. The files were then being sent to the United States. There was a kind of a claim that that transmission, that electronic transmission, was leading to issues in terms of patent infringement. And in the United States, there's a kind of a particular agency, the International Trade Commission, that has a lot of responsibility in relation to matters of intellectual property. Sometimes they've been accused of being a patent troll or facilitating patent trolling in various different ways. On other occasions, it's been argued that they can't play a useful role. So in this particular case, Align Technology sued its rival and kind of claimed that the ITC should be involved. There was this kind of larger debate about what was the jurisdiction of this international trade body. The matter then kind of became a pile-on. There were all these friend of the court briefs, amicuscuriae briefs by other interested parties. So a number of entities very interested in copyright matters started making arguments that the International Trade Commission should have a broad jurisdiction to consider such matters. So the Motion Picture Association of America, the Recording Industry Association of America, the Association of American Publishers, all intervened and say that the International Trade Commission could and should intervene in matters involving electronic transmissions, relating to intellectual property, including copyright law. There was really a very concerted effort in the United States with the Stop Online Piracy Act to try to give copyright owners the ability to block foreign websites. There was a big outcry against that, both by progressives and libertarians, and in the end that measure kind of collapsed. Really, in some ways, the copyright owners here are trying to do a circuitous move to achieve the same objective by trying to get the International Trade Commission to block electronic transmissions from other jurisdictions. Nokia was a telecommunications entity, and it said it wanted to have a broad position in relation to the jurisdiction of the International Trade Commission. In opposition was the Internet Association, the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Public Knowledge. So the key representative of some of the big internet companies, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has been very kind of concerned about digital rights. Public Knowledge have been particular champions of 3D printing. A kind of a curious player in the dispute was the Business Software Alliance, which was set up by Microsoft and has lots of other software companies involved in it. They were of the view that they didn't want the ITC to regulate matters related to intellectual property. Perhaps they were kind of concerned that they'd be a rather intrusive regulator in terms of their business. In the end, in a split decision, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit was of the view that the jurisdiction of the International Trade Commission did not extend to electronically transmitted data. So Justice Sharon Prost for the majority said that Congress is in a far better position to draw the lines that must be drawn if the product of intellectual processes rather than manufacturing processes are to be included within the statute. Justice Kathleen O'Malley concurred and said if Congress intended for the Commission to regulate one of the most important aspects of modern day life, Congress surely would have said so expressly. And Justice Pauline Newman, who's a very kind of experienced judge in relation to intellectual property matters, was very upset by the majority position, and she said the Commission's initial ruling was consistent with the language, structure and purpose of Section 337 and decades of precedent concerned with digital data, electronic transmission and infringing importation. The dispute between the parties has gone on, but in different fora. So the battles have kind of continued within the United States Patent and Trademark Office and in the courts in terms of various different attacks upon one another's patents in terms of their validity. Both entities still seem to be kind of quite wealthy. There seems to be quite a significant early emerging market in relation to 3D printing dental appliances. So that's the kind of first little case study that I have. I guess the second kind of transitional kind of area that I quickly want to look at is the competition between nation states in relation to 3D printing and additive manufacturing. Various different countries are investing heavily in new technologies to try to get some sort of comparative advantage. And that has been very kind of noticeable. Thomas Birchnell, who is a geographer from the University of Wollongong, has been very interested in some of those debates about whether or not 3D printing will help address some of the problems of developed nations in relation to the offshoring of manufacturing. he kind of argues that really there's not a lot of evidence yet that it's had that sort of impact in terms of leading to reshoring. But he says that we really need to think about the geography of innovation. Attorney John Hornick, who's very interested in 3D printing, has also been very kind of interested in some of the innovation races going on in relation to 3D printing and additive manufacturing, and he's kind of predicted that there will be trade conflicts and battles and maybe even wars between nation states over supremacy in relation to 3D printing and additive manufacturing and advanced manufacturing. We've seen some early skirmishes thus far in terms of some of these areas. So President Barack Obama was a great champion of 3D printing and additive manufacturing and saw it as a means of promoting education and innovation and manufacturing. His American Makes program was a way of setting up a public-private partnership to bring together the different sectors to work together on advancing 3D printing. Kind of a very interesting innovation model in terms of trying to boost the preeminence of the United States in a certain sector, partly driven by a concern that Germany perhaps was a little bit more advanced in certain respects in the sector, but also it was really kind of targeted to some of the depressed areas of the United States that had been hard hit by the loss of manufacturing. President Donald Trump, as we've heard from Professor Thurbin, has adopted a slightly different approach with his America First protectionist policy. In some ways, it taps into the great disquiet in depressed manufacturing areas in the United States about the loss of jobs and factories. But in some ways, he's been kind of very crude in terms of the way in which he has waged his trade battle with the China and with some of the other rivals. There's been a great deal of concern about some of the collateral impacts of some of the measures like tariffs. So Andrew Bonney Huang, who's a great hacker and computer security expert, has kind of argued that the tariffs that Trump placed in its trade war with China has not necessarily been very helpful in terms of 3D printing. So he kind of laments, these new tariffs are a tax on America's future. It deprives some of the most vulnerable groups of access to technology education, making future American workers less competitive on the global stage. So he's kind of particularly concerned that components were being the subject of tariffs rather than finished pieces. And really 3D printing, amongst other things, whether it be educational manufacturing, involved a whole wide range of different sorts of components. Likewise, Cory Doctorow, the digital rights activist, was very kind of concerned about how that would impact small American businesses and STEM education. He emphasised, you teach the next generation of hackers, makers, tinkerers, inventors and founders by showing them how this stuff works at the lowest levels, teaching them to assemble components into working systems. Those components suffer the highest levels of import taxes. Just quickly looking at some other areas, Canada has promoted superclusters. The European Union has been very interested in building up its capacities in relation to 3D printing and additive manufacturing. China has pursued a 2025 innovation policy, particularly focusing on investment in relation to 3D printing. There's obvious tensions between the United States and China at the moment. The United States has been complaining that China has been infringing various different forms of intellectual property. I just kind of want to wrap up by saying that various different global institutions have been exploring some of the legal and regulatory issues posed by intellectual property and 3D printing. There's been a whole range of different scenarios Some think that 3D printing will have a very revolutionary impact and will lead to the next industrial revolution. Others are much more sceptical and say that will only have a more marginal impact. There's a great issue in terms of the hype cycle surrounding 3D printing. The World Trade Organization has released a big new report on the future of trade, amongst other things that plots different scenarios in relation to trade and 3D printing. The World Intellectual Property Organization has analysed patent information associated with 3D printing, has tried to analyse what countries, what companies are dominant, and it's very noticeable that a very small cluster of countries from developed nations, along with China, have been dominating the 3D printing patent filings, and a key selection of conglomerates and some 3D printing specialist companies have been dominating the filings. The OECD has been very interested in 3D printing and sustainable innovation, which the next speaker is going to look at. And the World Economic Forum has been a kind of a big booster of 3D printing and has often had very utopian visions of 3D printing being part of a fourth industrial revolution with the convergence of a whole wide range of different technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence and information technology. So, in conclusion, in the future, I think we can expect many more conflicts over intellectual property and trade involving 3D printing and additive manufacturing and advanced manufacturing. The extent of those conflicts will depend a little bit about the commercial success of that technology and the extent to which it will be taken up in different sectors. Thank you very much.